Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to the dark side of RFK Jr. We're up to episode 14 now as we make our way through Jerry Oppenheimer's excellent book, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and the Dark Side of the Dream. This was published by St. Martin's Press 10 years ago now, back in 2015. We covered the divorce from Emily Black and his remarriage to Mary Richardson in the last episode, in episode 13. So we're into the 1990s at this point, which was a terrible decade for the Kennedy family, especially the RFKs. That branch of the family tree, Ethel's brood, and nobody covers Ethel Kennedy quite the way Jerry Oppenheimer does. If you've read the book that he wrote about Bobby's mom, the other Mrs. Kennedy, it is an eye-opener. I highly recommend it. So he has lots of sources that he's developed inside the RFK family tree, and nobody can dig up dirt quite the way Jerry Oppenheimer can. So as we get into this problematic story that we're in chapter 29, all about Bobby's siblings, his brothers Joe and Michael, and and Michael Skakel, of course. He was also arrested in the late 90s for the murder of his neighbor, Martha Moxley. You're probably familiar with that case, but that will come a little bit later in the story. But let's jump in. We're going to jump back in the early 1990s, and this is chapter 29. If you're reading along in the hardcover edition, we're starting today on page 291. Chapter 29, Sibling Scandals. Bobby's divorce and remarriage to pregnant Mary Richardson had escaped the usual media frenzy, but marital and other scandals engulfed the Kennedys in the decade of the 1990s, igniting banner headlines, and with Bobby usually somehow involved. All of it placed a dark and devastating cloud over America's most controversial family. Among the most horrific of these scandals involved his brother Michael Lemoyne Kennedy. His middle name was in honor of Lem Billings. He was the sixth of Ethel and RFK's mostly unruly mob of 11. Michael liked to live on the edge. That was demonstrated following reports that he'd become sexually involved as a married father of 3 in his 30s with his family's teenage babysitter, Marissa Verrocchi. As Bobby would later ironically describe Michael, he said, quote, "He was a Pied Piper to every child he ever met." Vicki Gifford, daughter of the famed football star and TV sports personality Frank Gifford, had never seriously dated anyone before Michael. When he was 24, he asked Vicki, a year younger, for her hand in marriage. They had first met when he was boarding at St. Paul's in Massachusetts, and Vicki was staying one summer at Hickory Hill as a guest of Ethel Kennedy, who was playing Cupid. The Giffords and the Kennedys went way back. In the 1970s, when RFK's widow was going out with a number of bold-faced, powerful men in politics and media, but swearing to her friends she would never remarry, she frequently was seen with a good-looking Frank Gifford, who was ending the first of his marriages. As Gifford later stated, "It was Ethel who brought my daughter Vicki into the Kennedys' orbit." Ethel had used her influence with her brother-in-law, Ted, the senator, to get 16-year-old Vicki a summer internship in his Washington office, and had asked the girl to stay with her at Hickory Hill for the duration. Michael's future wife also got into the congressional record, courtesy of the senator, who quoted from a high school paper she had written on the inequity of women's education. The Kennedy-Gifford wedding was held on March 14, 1981, at the Roman Catholic Park Avenue Church of St. Ignatius Loyola, and the bridesmaids wore actual nightgowns that had been custom-made in Switzerland at $75 apiece. The reception was held on the roof of the St. Regis Hotel, where Andy Warhol was asked by Bobby to trade ties, and even more curiously, pants with him. Bobby would later usually wear the tie to most every wedding he ever attended. Frank Gifford thought his new son-in-law, Michael, had a spooky resemblance to his father, RFK. Gifford also believed that one day Michael had the goods to be elected president and envisioned his daughter Vicky as the nation's first lady. But all of that was before Gifford had come to know his son-in-law as a booze-guzzling, cocaine-snorting sex addict who was cheating on his beloved daughter. One of the first to witness the relationship between Michael Kennedy and his family's babysitter was his cousin, Michael Skakel, one of Ethel Kennedy's nephews. Kennedy had arrived at Skakel's weekend ski chalet in Windham, New York, with his 3 children, Kyle Francis, Michael Lemoyne Jr., and Rory. In Vicky's place was the babysitter, who had been on the job since she was 12. The gorgeous, blonde teenager, Marissa, was the daughter of Paul Verrocchi, a wealthy Boston businessman. He sat on the board of then Massachusetts gubernatorial hopeful Joseph Patrick Kennedy II's Citizens Energy Corporation, and Verrocchi was a major Democratic fundraiser who had been considered for an ambassadorship in the Clinton administration. As Michael Skakel and his wife watched in shock, Michael and Marissa drank heavily and openly sexually played with each other. Quote, Michael asked her for a back rub and lay on the sofa while she straddled him and rubbed lotion on him, Michael Skakel claimed in the proposal for an unpublished late 90s tell-all book entitled Dead Man Talking, A Kennedy Cousin Comes Clean. The proposal had a most provocative subtitle, quote, the first account by an insider of the avarice, perversion, and gangsterism of America's royal family. Michael and Vicky Kennedy's young children were aware of his blatant 5-year relationship with the Verrocchi girl, Skakel claimed. He recalled being on a rafting trip with Michael and his brood. Once again, Vicky was not present, when Michael and Marissa, who had disappeared together for a while, returned to the campfire from the woods. When someone asked where they'd been, Marissa devilishly asked Michael with a wink, yeah, where have you been? Skakel happened to look over at his cousin's son, Michael Lemoyne Jr. He was not only not laughing, Skakel noted, but the depth of pain and confusion in his eyes frightened me. What a burden for a 13-year-old kid to have to carry. As a friend of Marissa's at their exclusive private school said at the time the scandal broke in the press in the spring of 1997, quote, she used to brag all the time about sleeping with the Kennedy guy, but nobody believed her until the stories came out. Another of the teenager's friends told a reporter she told people she had been caught in bed with him. At the time, Michael Kennedy was campaign manager for what would be the successful 1994 U.S. Senate re-election of his 62-year-old uncle, Ted, who was running against the 47-year-old conservative Mormon Republican businessman, Mitt Romney. The senator had a close friendship with and affection for Michael. Back in 1977, of all of Ted's nephews and nieces, only the Harvard sophomores Michael and his cousin Caroline Kennedy were invited to accompany him on his first and only trip to China. On the same weekend that Rose Kennedy died, on January 22, 1995, at the very ripe old age of 104, Michael Skakel drove Michael Kennedy to Father Martin's Ashley, a fancy private Catholic alcohol and drug rehab facility in Maryland, for the treatment of his, quote, out-of-control behavior as an alcoholic and what Skakel termed as his many other infidelities, in addition to the babysitter. At the matriarch's wake, Joe Kennedy confronted Michael Skakel, demanding to know where he'd installed his brother for rehab. When Skakel described the facility, his cousin began laughing. Michael doesn't have a booze problem, Joe Kennedy declared, according to Skakel. Michael has a pee-pee problem. What happened? Did he get caught fucking that babysitter? Michael Kennedy's trip to rehab had followed within hours of the shocking discovery by Vicki Gifford Kennedy of her husband in bed with Marissa Verrocchi in one of the Kennedys' spare bedrooms at their home. Kennedy had blamed his drinking for his illicit affair with the teenage babysitter and family friend, and his wife believed him, at least for the time being. When Verrocchi turned to Skakel to determine what she should do about Kennedy, he asked his cousins, Bobby and Joe, for help. Both adamantly refused, Skakel claimed. According to Skakel, Bobby's response was, quote, "I don't see how that's any of your business." And his brother Joe's retort was, "My brother can fuck anybody he wants." On his own, Skakel took Marissa Verrocchi to a therapist who suggested that she tell her parents about her illicit and illegal relationship. Around that time, Michael Kennedy was caught stalker-like on a security camera breaking into the garage where the teenager kept her car. He left behind a bizarre offering, an artificial penis that he had attached to her windshield. As Skakel later claimed, he was dangerous. Michael Kennedy's family, particularly his brothers, Bobby and Joe, and their mother, Ethel, faced with the magnitude of the scandalous situation, closed ranks and began, as Skakel put it, circling the wagons to protect the cesspool. When Michael Kennedy got wind that Michael Skakel was assisting and advising Marissa Verrocchi and that she was finally telling all to her parents, he went ballistic. Skakel recalled Michael Kennedy declaring, "Oh my God, oh Jesus, I'm going to go to jail. How could you do this to me, Skakel? Who the fuck do you think you are? You've gone off the fucking reservation. What the fuck do you think you're doing taking Marissa to a therapist? I had her under control. Now you fucked everything up." Skakel claimed that Kennedy told him, "What if I got Vicki pregnant? What do you think? If we had another kid on the way, they wouldn't put me in jail, would they? And that would take Vicki's mind off all of this for a while, too." Kennedy subsequently did a stint in an Arizona rehab center for his sex addiction, and he followed one of the rules set down for him. Identify in writing the names of all the women with whom he had had sexual trysts. A few years later, Bobby, in his own diary, would do something similar. When the sordid details of Michael Kennedy's philandering were revealed, Vicki Gifford Kennedy, shocked by the number of women with whom he had obsessively had sex, some of whom she knew, took their children in the spring of 1997 and left him after 16 years of a troubled marriage. A statement released to the Associated Press stated, quote, "We have reached this decision amicably. Out of respect for our families, we hope the press and the public will understand our wish to decline further comment on this personal matter." The story of the Kennedy-Verrocchi affair broke in the Boston Globe shortly thereafter. Having turned 18 and become a college freshman, Marissa finally decided to confess all to her parents. Her mother was so devastated that the next day she climbed to the roof of the trendy 6-story Boston building where she and her husband had a chic apartment and threatened to jump. According to reports, a spokesman for the family denied that suicide was the motive. In early July 1997, the recently appointed Republican District Attorney of Norfolk County, Massachusetts, Jeffrey Locke, revealed that the Verrocchis had decided not to pursue a prosecution of the 39-year-old Kennedy scion. Sex with someone under the age of 16 constituted statutory rape in the Bay State, and a conviction could result in a life sentence. Locke disclosed that Marissa Verrocchi, who had recently turned 19, had let it be known through her attorney that she wouldn't participate further in the investigation of her former lover, Michael Kennedy, and would, in fact, invoke her Fifth Amendment right not to testify if called. As a result, the case was dropped. The usually verbose Bobby, who had remained quiet throughout the scandal, had a few words to say after the district attorney's announcement. Quote, "A lot of people's lives have been ruined," he observed. "I feel most about the children. I think it's a tragedy for everyone who's involved." In June 1997, the New York Times published a special report headlined, "Struggling to Please the Father Who Died." The story noted that the children of Robert Kennedy and their cousins are lumped together and stained by the stumblings and exploits of a few, by the alcohol and drug abuse, the arrests, the sex scandals. Bobby's drug issues were highlighted in the article, including his trips to Harlem to buy heroin. He was quoted as saying, quote, "I had impulses. At the time, it seemed kind of innocent, almost like a political statement. Then it turned into something else. I hadn't seen it coming." And, he added, "All of us are blessed, not only with gifts, but with profound personal struggles. I went through a long period where I was knowingly living against my conscience." Vanity Fair in August 1997 published a similar story under the headline, "Bobby's Kids." The family values of RFK's brood were compared to those of the mafia. Bobby was portrayed as a daredevil who had conquered his drug addiction. In the aftermath of the babysitter sex scandal, the Ethel and RFK branch of the Kennedy dynasty celebrated Michael's freedom in the posh ski resort of Aspen, Colorado, where they had wintered for decades and where some of them had also gotten into trouble. One of the Kennedys' favorite games on the slopes of Aspen was ski football, tossing footballs or other objects while on skis, and they were playing it again on New Year's Eve 1998 on their favorite snow-covered field, Ajax Mountain. They weren't even using a real football that day, but rather were said to have been tossing a bottle filled with water. Bobby's close friend, Harvey Blake Fleetwood, was in the game, and it was Fleetwood who threw the fatal final pass that Michael caught over his shoulder. In a split second, he had slammed headfirst into a birch tree. He died of massive head injuries on arrival at Aspen Valley Hospital. He was 39. At his funeral at the old wooden Roman Catholic church, Our Lady of Victory in Centerville, Massachusetts, Bobby asserted that the personal issues his brother had faced involving the sex scandal were, quote, "about humanity and passion. His transgressions were the kind that Christ taught us were the first and easiest to forgive." Those of us who know the truth know that so much of what Michael suffered over the last year was unfair, and yet every indignity was endured in dignified silence. He stayed sober. He refused to run away. And he never stopped having fun. Michael's friends can take comfort that because he did his penance here on earth, he went straight to heaven and now sits with Father and David and Lem and Jack and Kick and Joe and Grandma and Grandpa, almost certainly laughing and waiting to greet the rest of us as we arrive. Chapter 30, Annulment Tell-All. Bobby's politician brother, Joe's own controversial marital issues had surfaced in the midst of his brother Michael's sex scandal. It seemed as if the whole third generation was imploding. Joe and his wife, Sheila Brewster Rausch Kennedy, a Harvard-educated Philadelphia mainline socialite, mother of their twin sons, had been married for some 12 years when Kennedy became romantically involved with Anne Elizabeth, known as Beth Kelly, a pretty one-time temp he had hired at Citizens Energy, his Boston company that supplied heating oil to the poor. When Sheila married Kennedy, she had her own non-Catholic minister standing next to her groom's Roman Catholic priest, and she was the one who filed for divorce. The marriage had been an emotional roller coaster for Sheila. Even though she had a master's degree from the Harvard School of Design, Kennedy often denigrated and bullied her, she claimed, calling her a nobody. Joe, Ethel and RFK's first son, had earned a reputation as a bully, As his cousin, Christopher Kennedy Lawford, eloquently noted, by the time Joe hit the testosterone-producing years of puberty, he had developed a fairly regular addiction to punching someone over something. Lawford recalled that Bobby was often the brunt of Joe's violence and had suffered a lifetime of beatings from his older brother. While Kennedy often allegedly berated Sheila, like he had berated and bullied his brothers and cousins years earlier, the woman who would become the second Mrs. Joe Kennedy, Beth Kelly, was different in his eyes. She initially impressed him mainly because, quote, she was someone who could really type and get all the grammar and punctuation right, he once said after he hired the 25-year-old temp at Citizens Energy in 1982. Beth Kelly had risen to the post of Director of Special Projects at the firm, and Kennedy described her as its heart and soul. When he won his first congressional election in 1986, she went to Washington with him and became his scheduler and personal secretary, and as a friend said, pretty much managed his professional and personal life. But Kennedy was vociferous in his contention that they had not become romantically involved until after he had formally separated from his wife. When Joe and Sheila were divorced, she got what was described as a nominal settlement and was so cash poor that she was said to have had to borrow money from her parents to buy a home for her and the two boys. 2 years after his 1991 no-fault civil divorce, he wanted to marry Beth within the church, and in 1993 petitioned the Vatican to grant an annulment of his first marriage, but it had seemingly stalled. Sheila was mortified when she learned what he was planning, which, in essence, would make it appear as if they had never tied the knot in what had been a big, splashy society wedding back in 1973. In 1997, she shocked the clan and the world by publishing a controversial and well-received book, Shattered Faith, A Woman's Struggle to Stop the Catholic Church from Annulling Her Marriage. In it, she declared the annulment, quote, would have rendered their union non-existent, and their sons would have been regarded as children of an unsanctified union. The book was reviewed positively in the New York Times under the headline, A Woman Scorned. But the Independent, a liberal British newspaper, called her a, quote, vindictive, embittered, loose cannon of an ex-wife. In the book, the devout Protestant declared, I was appalled. My husband and I had known each other for 9 years before we got married in a Catholic ceremony. I could not understand how anyone could claim that our marriage had never been valid. If she agreed to Kennedy's request for the annulment, she declared, I would be lying before God. After the annulment was granted in secret by the church, Sheila appealed, and a decade after her book was published, the annulment was reversed by the Vatican. As it turned out, 36-year-old Beth Kelly, a Jersey girl, the daughter of a retired Navy pilot and a mother who had been a Navy nurse, became the second Mrs. Joe Kennedy in July of 1993. It was a civil ceremony at which Ethel and Ted Kennedy and Ted's second wife, Vicki, sang When Irish Eyes Are Smiling as Joe and Beth walked down the aisle in Joe's home in Brighton, Massachusetts. Time magazine, in reporting the Vatican's reversal, wryly noted, the most controversial marriage that never was in recent U.S. political history is back. The Washington Post reported that all the messy publicity about Michael Kennedy's sex scandal and the tangled affairs of Joe Kennedy's own marriage had combined to smudge the image of the heir apparent to the Kennedy dynasty. Joe Kennedy had decided not to seek re-election to Congress, which the New York Times, in an editorial, declared runs counter to the family's combative never-say-die image. Charges of improper sexual relations with a teenage babysitter against his brother Michael had already forced the congressman to drop out of the Massachusetts governor's race. Even with Mr. Kennedy out of Washington, there is not likely to be any shortage of Kennedys in public life. nor will there be an end to the complicated feelings aroused by the family's gripping sense of sacrifice and entitlement. The most swooned over Kennedy namesake of Bobby's generation, his cousin, John F. Kennedy Jr., used the editor's letter in the September 1997 issue of his own political and pop culture magazine, George, to upbraid Michael and Joe, calling them poster boys for bad behavior. Joe Kennedy was furious when he read his more famous and much better-looking cousin's attack, bellowing, "Ask not what you can do for your cousin, ask what you can do for his magazine," which was a snarky play on JFK's famous January 20th, 1961 inaugural address. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. JFK Jr. didn't play gentle. He wrote, in part, "Two members of my family chased an idealized alternative to their life. One left behind an embittered wife, and another, in what looked to be a hedge against mortality, fell in love with youth and surrendered his judgment in the process. Both became poster boys for bad behavior. Perhaps they deserved it. Perhaps they should have known better. To whom much is given, much is expected, right?" The very public assault pitting a Kennedy against Kennedys made headlines around the world. The respected Guardian newspaper in London called it a virulent and puzzling critique, accompanied by an odd picture of a half-naked John Jr. with the apple of temptation, and quite unprecedented for a family who have always circled the wagons when under attack. Long supportive of Kennedy-style liberal politics, the New York Times was uncharacteristically harsh in its editorial assessment of what it called John Kennedy's sophomoric essay. It termed his writing vapid and chatty and declared that his critique, quote, "is not likely to put much glow on his own image as an editorial stylist and thinker." And the Times termed the commentary, quote, "another sign of the end of the Kennedys as an entitled political class." In November 2012, one of Joe and Sheila's twin sons, 32-year-old Joe Kennedy III, became the first Kennedy of his generation to win public office as a congressman from Massachusetts, of course. His mother, who had never remarried, stood on the podium beside him and later told a reporter, quote, "Joe is very different from his father, very hardworking, very aware of the need for balance in his life." That's the end of that chapter. But before I move on to the next chapter, if you've not followed the career of Joe Kennedy III, he was in Congress. He was the representative from Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District from 2013 until 2021. And then he was actually the United States Special Envoy for Northern Ireland from 2022 until 2024, appointed by President Joe Biden. Chapter 31, Rape Rap. William Kennedy Smith was the son of Jean Kennedy Smith, who had famously introduced her close Catholic school friend Ethel Skakel to her brother, RFK. In 1991, 30-year-old Willie, as he was called, was a popular fourth-year Georgetown University medical student, but his status changed in the pre-dawn hours of Holy Saturday, March 31st, 1991, Easter weekend, after a night of nightclub hopping in Palm Beach with his uncle, the hard-drinking womanizer Ted Kennedy, and Kennedy's son, Patrick, then a 23-year-old Rhode Island state representative. At a local bar, Smith had picked up an attractive 30-year-old woman, a single mom by the name of Patricia Bowman, who would later accuse him of raping her. She claimed that she was assaulted by Smith after they spent time on the beach in front of the Kennedy mansion. About a month after the alleged assault, Smith was charged with felony sexual battery and also misdemeanor battery. The scandal would make worldwide headlines, and Palm Beach was invaded by hundreds of journalists. During the 10-day trial, A number of Kennedy family members were there in the courtroom en masse to show support for the accused rapist. Among them were Ethel Kennedy and two of her past and future scandal-riddled sons, Bobby and Michael. John F. Kennedy Jr. also made an appearance under a lot of family pressure. The writer, Dominic Dunn, who covered the trial, had been invited to a dinner party at the time and recalled a childhood chum of Jackie Kennedy's telling a society pal that the Kennedy family would never be able to convince the former First Lady to attend Willie's trial. She didn't, and neither did her daughter, Caroline. Nevertheless, all the Kennedys who were present were joyous when the judge ruled out sworn testimony by three other women who claimed they had also been assaulted by Smith back in the 1980s, but they hadn't reported the alleged attacks to authorities out of embarrassment and fear of retribution. In the end, the 6 jurors, having heard the testimony of Ted Kennedy and others, returned a not guilty verdict after just 27 minutes of deliberation. I have an enormous debt to the system and to God, and I have terrific faith in both of them, the acquitted Smith said after the verdict. His mother said, "I feel relieved." The prosecutor who tried the case had a far different take. What you heard during the course of this trial was not an act of love, not an act of sex. It was an act of violence. Once again, despite Willie Smith's earnest words, there was general suspicion of a cover-up and the use of Kennedy power and influence to bring about a quick acquittal. To some, it was another Chappaquiddick ending. Some years later, in his book proposal, Michael Skakel claimed that during the Michael Kennedy babysitter sex scandal, Michael Skakel had a conversation with Bobby, who allegedly said of his brother Michael, "Oh my God, he's just like Willie." When Skakel asked what he meant, he claimed that Bobby responded that William Kennedy Smith was, quote, guilty of rape, that his acquittal was the result of Kennedy power. While John Kennedy Jr. didn't mention Willie Smith in his biting 1997 George magazine editorial, the one that lambasted Michael and Joe, he allegedly had a shocking story involving the Palm Beach rape case. In a little-known December 30th, 1993 sworn affidavit given to a member of the U.S. Congress and read into the congressional record by Ohio Democrat James Traficant, an acquaintance of Kennedy's, James Ridgway claimed that JFK Jr. had questioned Smith's innocence. James Ridgway had decided to come forward and volunteer this information because Kennedy had refused to make public what he claimed he knew. An account of the blockbuster affidavit appeared in both the New York Daily News and the National Enquirer. James Ridgway, who had voluntarily taken and passed a polygraph test in connection with the affidavit, stated that JFK Jr., then an assistant district attorney in New York City, had told him that, quote, they, the Kennedy family, should have done something about Willie years ago when he first started doing this, meaning to get help for him when he first started raping women, unquote. Kennedy made the revelation to the witness 2 months after Smith was charged in the Palm Beach case. John told me, the affidavit continued, that when the Smith trial took place, he would have to put in an appearance in the courtroom. He told me he did not want to do this, and his mother did not want him to either. I suggested that he not do it since Willie was guilty, but he told me who was pressuring him and why. He just said his presence in the courtroom would make an impression on the jury, which is how they're using me, unquote. As part of the effort to have Smith acquitted, John Kennedy Jr. was asked to pose for a news photo with his cousin. In the affidavit, it states he was, quote, livid with John for doing it. Quote, it was obvious to me he was participating in this campaign of character assassination being waged by his family against the victim, Patricia Bowman, and that the photograph, which was peddled to papers all over the world, was part of that campaign. At first, he denied it, continues the affidavit. I asked how it came to be that even though they were on the beach in the middle of nowhere, a photographer just happened to be there. I told him it was obvious the photograph was a public expression of confidence and trust in his cousin, concocted by the same PR people who were characterizing Miss Bowman in the press as a lying, crazy slut. John then admitted the photograph was in fact staged. The photo, which had appeared in a number of newspapers, had been taken 4 months after Smith was charged. I then asked him if this was his new hobby, committing character assassination against innocent people. James Ridgway stated, "He would not answer nor look me in the eye. He was sitting on the couch and I was standing, walking around. I then called him A Profile in Cowardice, which was a play on his father's best-selling, Pulitzer Prize-winning 1957 book, Profiles in Courage, and I suggested he step forward and vindicate Patricia Bowman. I remember every word of the next 2 angry questions I asked him. How does it feel to be a character assassin, John? How does it feel to be Patricia Bowman's Oswald?" He did not say nor do anything in response. He just sat there, his head hung down in shame. Then, after a long, awful silence, he said, "You just don't understand the pressure I'm under." In a letter to Representative Trafficant, subsequent to having given his sworn affidavit, James Ridgway claimed that if Kennedy didn't cooperate in making a public show of support for Smith, he faced the release of personal information about his private life. In his letter, James Ridgway used the word blackmail. When he gave his affidavit, he never identified the person that he claimed Kennedy had told him was, quote, forcing him to prejudice the jury in the Smith trial. Everyone, James Ridgway wrote to Representative Trafficant, assumed that it was John's uncle, Teddy, who had forced him.
Tonight, in response to suggestions that he attempted to interfere with the police investigation of an alleged rape involving his nephew, William Smith. Senator Kennedy says there is no truth to those suggestions. In his words, "As soon as I became aware that the police wished to speak to me, I made arrangements to talk to them." With more, here's ABC's Bob Jamieson.
Edward Kennedy went about his Senate business today amid new questions of whether he left Palm Beach on Easter weekend without talking to police, knowing they were investigating rape charges against his nephew. Documents released by Palm Beach police have also raised the question of whether Kennedy lied publicly about his knowledge of the case. In public statements, the senator has repeatedly denied knowing of the rape accusations until after he returned to Washington.
And the first time I knew that there was an allegation of rape was on Monday afternoon.
But Kennedy's son Patrick told police he and his father heard about the accusation Easter Sunday night. He said it happened in a beachfront conversation with former FBI agent William Berry, a family friend who had talked to police. Investigators asked Patrick, "So your father was there to hear of the allegation of sexual battery?" Patrick responded, "Yes. Sexual battery is the legal term for rape in Florida." Did Kennedy know that and deliberately avoid talking to police? According to records, police first visited the Kennedy estate at 1:30 p.m. on Easter, but did not raise the issue of sexual assault. They asked to talk to Kennedy and the nephew, William Smith. Berry told the detectives that neither man was there, though police now believe they were. Berry said he would ask Senator Kennedy to call police in an hour. At 2:40, when Kennedy had not called, police phoned the estate. A housekeeper said Berry had taken Senator Kennedy and Smith to the airport. Actually, Kennedy did not leave until the next day. At 3:20 p.m., Berry called police, who said for the first time that they were investigating an alleged sexual attack. According to police, Berry said officers had just missed Kennedy and Smith, but that he would give them the message to call. Berry said he did not mention to the senator that police wanted to talk to him. In a transcript of his statement to police, the senator admitted that he knew of calls from officers about a serious offense. That Easter Sunday night, Kennedy called a prominent Florida lawyer, Marvin Rosen, and later told William Smith to contact Rosen. Tonight, the senator issued a statement saying he had cooperated fully with the police investigation. And Kennedy said there is no contradiction between his public statements and what he told police about that weekend, because the word rape was never used while he was in Palm Beach. Bob Jameson, ABC News, New York.
An aide to Jim Trafficant at the time, Lisa Hall, described James Ridgway as 100% credible. He passed a polygraph test with flying colors. Everything he had to say about his conversations with John F. Kennedy Jr. is completely true and accurate. Presumably against his will, John Kennedy Jr. did make appearances at the Smith trial, beginning with 2 days during the important jury selection process. As expected, his presence received intense media coverage, but he denied to reporters that his visit was in any way an attempt to influence the case. Representative Jim Trafficant had his own legal problems. In the early 2000s, after being convicted of bribery, racketeering, and tax evasion for personally using campaign contributions, he was expelled from the House of Representatives on a vote of 420 to 1, and he served 7 years in prison. He died in September 2014 when a tractor on his daughter's Ohio farm flipped over on him. He was 73. JFK Jr. wasn't the only Kennedy cousin to suspect William Kennedy Smith of having sex, forced or not, with the Bowman woman. Ted Kennedy's son, Patrick, who had been bar hopping with his father and Smith, had told police that Smith had admitted sleeping with the woman. "How was she? Did you wear protection?" Kennedy said he asked Smith the next morning, according to media reports. "No," Smith answered, "but thank God I pulled out." And I think that's a good place to stop for now. It kind of ties into the next episode. What we're going to get into in episode 15 is the story of how Bobby Kennedy Jr. used his own power and influence to get another Kennedy cousin off the hook a few years later, his cousin Michael Skakel, who, as you probably recall, was convicted of murdering his neighbor, 15-year-old Martha Moxley, back in 1975. In fact, the 50th anniversary of that murder, that grisly murder, is coming up this year. It's a very disturbing case, and Bobby Kennedy Jr. is probably the reason that Michael is now out of prison. He managed to get that conviction vacated and actually got his cousin out of prison and off the hook for murder. It's a hell of a story, and we'll tell it next time in episode 15. So be sure to hit that notifications bell, subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss that episode, and you'll be notified every time a new episode is uploaded. So we'll see you next time on the dark side of RFK Jr. Until then, I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.